This video will focus on primary build.json and primary release dynamics-only.json. I'm going to assume that you've already read the introduction and understand the difference between the two. To familiarize ourselves with primary build.json, I'm going to take a look at one that's already been deployed to VSTS. Later in the video, I'll show you how you can import these JSON files into VSTS. For now, let's take a look at what's going on here. So if we come into VSTS, I've navigated to the build section. And I'm just going to edit this release so we can take a look at it. I'm going to edit the build so we can take a look at it. So a few things to note about the build so that when I walk you through how to import it yourself, you're familiar. First, in this case, I've chosen to get the sources from a remote repository. And so basically what this is doing is instead of pointing to source control in this VSTS project, I'm pointing to a remote Git repo. And so that remote repo is referenced here in the introduction. And so what we're telling Visual Studio Team Services is to build off of this source code. Next, the build restores all of the NuGet packages that any of the projects in the solution reference. Then it builds the Visual Studio solution. And we'll jump into Visual Studio shortly, but I just want to go through the build steps. Then it uses a VSTS task that I've downloaded from the Visual Studio Marketplace to pack the solution. So if you're not familiar with the solution packager tool in the CRM SDK, there is a reference right here on the home page to that tool. As a general rule, the point of this video is to get you to understand how all these things come together, not necessarily to teach you the individual parts. However, I've provided links to those individual parts so you can do that research on your own. And so we pack the solution, and this is essentially the process of taking all of the fine-grained XML files that represent the point-and-click configuration done in Dynamics 365 and recomposing them, including the DLLs for plugins and other things, into a solution package zip file. Next, I'm zipping up some sample data, which again I'll explain in more detail. However, similarly, I have a link to the tool that was used to create the sample data. And I use the term sample data, but this could be initial data that you need to pull into lookup entities, essentially anything that can be stored in Dynamics 365 entities. And last but not least, the build copies the files and publishes them to the drop location. And this is the place that then a release can pick up an individual build and do something with. So to understand the source code we're building off of, you're going to want to come over here and either clone or download this separate repository. However, I already have it on my machine, and we'll just take a look at it. So again, the things to really pay attention for this part of the video is we have a solution package. And inside there, you'll notice that there are individual XML files for the most finely grained unit that can be source controlled. So for example, for the form, we have a main form, and we have an XML file for that. For the entity, we have an XML file for the entity. For views and saved queries, we have XML files for those. And so the idea here is that some of your assets in source control will be source code, like C# files and JavaScript files, etc. Some of your assets in source control will be the output of what you've done through point-and-click configuration inside a Dynamics 365 instance. So the workflow here is essentially that I go into a Dynamics 365 instance, I do some point-and-click configurations, I export the zip file, I use Solution Packager to unpack it and put it into these individual XML files, and then I check those changes into source control. We also have a map.xml file here, which is an XML file that tells the Solution Packager tool how to recompose everything in source control into a proper Dynamics 365 solution file, which, as you know, is just a zip file of a larger set of those recomposed XML files, and then things like .NET DLLs, HTML files, JavaScript files, etc. So what this file does is it basically says, go find the DLL that gets built by this plugin project right here to build the solution package zip file, and then go find the web resources to bring into the solution package zip file from the web resources project down here. Again, if we open up the package and you look at web resources, you'll notice that there is metadata for the web resources, but not the actual web resource files, because the actual web resource files exist over here in this project. So I can edit them and test them, etc. Similarly, for plugins, you'll notice that there is metadata for the plugin assembly. There's metadata for the SDK message processing step, but the actual source code for the plugin gets built and compiled into a DLL off of this source control here. And so again, these steps compose what's in source control into the deployable assets. We build all the .NET code, we package up the solution package off of the .NET code, the HTML and JavaScript web resources, and the individual XML files that represent the metadata about the solution package into a proper CRM solution package zip file. And then again, the sample data, if I go over here, you'll look at the sample data project. Literally what this is just the XML inside of a zip file that can be created with this tool called the configuration migration tool that's part of the SDK. So very similarly, I don't want to check in zip files into source control. I want the raw format so I can look at the changes of those individual files over time, right, for configuration management. So I basically used the tool to create the zip file, and then I unzip the contents of that file into the folder for this project. And then at build, I recompose that file into the format that is necessary to then deploy that sample data or that initial data. And to just kind of bring that all home and put it into perspective, let's go over here and take a look at the solution in its deployed form. All right, so we've got an app and a sitemap XML for the app. We've got an entity. We've got a .NET plugin assembly. We've got some web resources, and we have that SDK processing messaging step. So this is the source control view of all that. This is the deployed asset view of all that, right? The result of the build. Next, let's take a look at primary release dynamics only. Now again, this is in the GitHub project as a JSON file, which I'll show you how to import later, but I just want to walk through that release. So if I come over here to releases, and I select primary release dynamics only and edit it, you'll notice that the release definition uses the primary build as the source artifact. And in my case, it has a single environment. And so environments in VSTS are what you might expect they are. You can have one for dev, test, and prod, and you may have different steps in each of those releases. For example, in dev, you may just be installing a unmanaged solution on top of an unmanaged solution, or on occasion, you may be resetting your instance and then installing an unmanaged solution. In test or prod, you may be testing out installing the latest version of a managed solution on top of a managed solution, etc. But for simplicity's sake, since these reference templates are intended to help you get started, I've got a single environment with a bunch of tasks. So let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on here. So first of all, we're running this on the hosted VS 2017 agent, which is available to us with VSTS, so we don't have to deploy and configure our own agent. And in this example, one of the things I wanted to show is how you can use the new online management API to do things like reset instances, etc. And by the time you watch the video, there's probably a good chance that these three tasks are replaced by a singular task that has this same icon. If you actually go over to the issues section of the GitHub project, you'll see some tasks, some to-do items, like replace the reset Dynamics 365 instance PowerShell scripts with the XRM CI framework task. And I've got a little bit of note here, which basically means there's contributions in process in this other GitHub project, so that these three tasks can be replaced by a singular task. But in the interest of time and getting this out to the community, I went ahead and built these ahead of those tasks being available. Basically what this does is it installs the PowerShell module to call the Dynamics 365 Online Management API. It downloads a little helper script that's sitting in another GitHub repository that you can go take a look at, and then it calls that script, passing it a bunch of values. And so once you start to look at these templates, that's one of the sort of benefits of these templates is that I'm showing examples of how you can use things like VSTS variables to pass values in a configured fashion. So for example, if we go back to this task, all the values that we're handing over to this PowerShell script comes from VSTS variables. And as you might imagine, if you look at variables here, you can see that there's a scope. So you can have release level variables that apply to all environments, and then you can have variables for your different environments. For example, dev, test, and prod. And the other thing that you'll notice in these variables, and so you'll notice over here what's an environment variable and what's a release variable. You'll also notice that I'm sort of composing values off of other variables so that as much as possible, we're not keying in configuration values multiple times. So for example, to compose a Dynamics connection string, I'm getting the username from this variable down here. I'm getting the username from this variable down here, and that username is composed of this variable and this variable. To get the URL for the instance, I'm composing that as well based off of this variable over here, this variable over here, and the string. And you can see that pattern throughout. I'm composing the password here off of the password variable, and you'll notice the password variable is protected using VSTS's ability to protect sensitive information. All right, so if we come back to the tasks, once we've reset the Dynamics 365 instance. Now, in your example, I wanted to keep this simple for demonstration purposes. You know, some of the additional use cases we can build out based on community feedback might be, for example, backing up the instance before we reset it, right? Because it's very common that you want to, as you test out a release, test out the ability to install it on a fresh instance. You may have another environment, right, that tests out installing that release on top of a previous version. And you can imagine other examples. So that's one of the things we want to get feedback from the community on is what are the valuable scenarios to implement as reference templates that you can accelerate your ability to implement these scenarios. So strongly encourage you to come to the issues section and add issues that we can then triage and prioritize for future releases of these templates. All right, so back to the release. So the first thing is we reset the instance, then we deploy the Dynamics 365 package. Now this warrants some explanation because this uses another tool. So if you come over to the introduction, you'll notice that I make reference to package deployer. There's another tool in the SDK that allows you to take a zip file, as well as sample data, as well as pre and post deployment steps that you want to execute in a coordinated fashion to deploy your application. And so if you come over to Visual Studio, you'll notice that there's a deployment package project, and it's got a package template.cs file. This is where you can do things like pre and post deployment code execution, and I'll explain that in a second. And then you have a package folder, which has an import config.xml. Again, this is just a high-level overview of how package deployer works. I strongly encourage you to do some research to learn package deployer in more detail. But basically what we're doing here is we're saying install the solution package and do not activate the plugins, and use this as the source sample data file for that import initial or sample data process. Now you may ask yourself, okay, but those files don't exist over here in source control. And that's right, because they were actually built as part of the build. Because remember, you don't want build assets in your source control. So if you were to go back to the build definition and look at the values in more detail, you'll see that after the solution is packaged, we copy the zip file to this directory in the drop folder. And similarly, we copy this zip file to this directory in the drop folder. And so what actually happens is this project builds a .NET DLL that then points to this XML file, right? And so the XML file tells the whole package deployer engine to do what we're declaratively defining in this XML file. And then, since I told through the XML file package deployer to not activate the plugins, I want to then come in and execute a little bit of code here that basically says, find all the SDK messages in this solution package and activate them. And you'll notice that this is after the import. So it's after the sample data was executed. And this is a pretty common scenario that people want to import their sample data or their initial data first and then turn on their plugins. All right, so let's go back to the release. After we've deployed the package and the data using package deployer, the last thing I wanted to be able to demonstrate, which is a common operation from dev to test to prod, is that if you're using plugin secure configuration, you know that those values don't live within the solution package. And that is because plugin secure configuration is intended to be the place where you put sensitive configuration data that you need to pass to your plugins. So I've written a little helper executable called update secure configuration that will update secure configuration. Now, similarly, how I mentioned these three steps will be replaced by the time, chances are these three steps will be replaced by the time you watch this video. These three steps will as well, because I've contributed the work that I did here back to the same project that creates and then publishes these MSCRM steps or tasks, VSTS tasks, to the Visual Studio Marketplace. So keep an eye out for a future update to this GitHub project where these three can be replaced. But for now, basically what I'm doing is I'm going and I'm downloading that a zip file that contains the executable, and I wanted it to be in a separate repository so it can be reused by folks and downloaded. So you're basically just downloading this from GitHub, unzipping the zip file, and then calling that executable. And again, that executable takes a dynamics connection string and then the values for secure config. And if you look over here at the variables, and this will be improved for the actual task that's available on the marketplace, and I launch Notepad, for example, you'll see that the format here is essentially a JSON array of the plugin registration step ID and then the secure configuration to pass it. So you could create multiples of these. But in my case, so for example, you could, you could do this, right? And as many of these you pass, these set of steps will go ahead and update secure configuration. And again, notice I'm using VSTS variables to compose through configuration what actually gets sent. Of course, this would need to be a different GUID, but you get the idea. And again, just simply due to timing of recording this video, I wasn't able to show the new task because it hasn't been published to the VSTS marketplace, but chances are when you come to see this, you'll see something very similar, except instead of these three tasks, they're all encapsulated in a single task with the same icon here. So there's a couple things I want to highlight before we transition to how to import these into your own environment. First, if you look at the builds here, and I edit this build, and look at triggers, you'll notice that this is not set up for continuous integration. This is intentional because this is supposed to be a reference template. It's really up to you and your team's culture whether or not you want the build to be triggered every time something gets checked into the main branch. But for simplicity's sake, this is a manual build. So anytime you come in here and you want to trigger the build, you just come in here and you select Queue New Build and you'll get a build triggered. Right, so if I actually look at the last build I had, you You can look, for example, at the artifacts, and you'll see if you explore this or download it, you'll see everything that's copied over the drop folder. And in fact, if I navigate down to my deployment package, you'll see that we have the data zip file and the solution zip file copied over as an output of the build. If you come over to releases, similarly, if I edit this release, you'll notice if I click on this lightning bolt icon, you'll notice that this is a manual release. Again, that's intentional. You could certainly have other triggers, but I intentionally wanted this to be a manual trigger. So often cases in continuous delivery, you trigger a deployment off of every time a build comes in. Again, that's up to you and your team and your culture. But in this case, I just wanted this to be a reference template. And if I go back here and we take a look at one of these releases, if I want to deploy it to a particular environment after the release is created, I just come in here and click deploy. And notice I have my environment. If you had a dev, test, prod, scenario X environment configured as part of this release, those would all show up as well. So you can choose which environment you want to deploy the release to. And if you look over here at the logs, for example, you can get a sense of how long these things take, and you can go look at the logs for each individual task and step in the overall release deployment process. All right, so that's a high-level walkthrough of the build and the more simple of the two release definitions. Next, we'll walk through how to import these into your own Visual Studio Team Services project and get them up and running. All right, so to do that, the first thing you're going to want to do is come over to this repository and either clone or download the code so you have access to these 3 JSON files, or for this video, this JSON file and that JSON file. Once you've done that, you're going to need your own Visual Studio Team Services project. Again, if you go to visualstudio.com, there's instructions on how to get set up with VSTS. So I'm not going through all the steps of the different components of this. I'm really just focusing on how to bring all these things together. But once you have a project, you want to come into builds, and the way you do that is you just navigate to builds here and select import. Now I already have the JSON files locally on my machine, so I'm going to grab primary build.json. Click open and import. Now, because I authored this in a different environment, there are a few steps that you're going to have to make sure that you come through and set manually before the imported JSON file will work. So first of all, make sure that you're using the hosted VS 2017 agent queue. If you come over to the Get Sources section, you'll notice that we don't have a connection to that GitHub repository, so we have to add one. And I'm going to call this GitHub dev keydet, which is my repository. And then oh, that's the wrong one. We actually want the source code for the application. So I'm going to grab this one. And then I actually want this URL. And so there's no username or password or token key necessary because this is a public Git repo. So I'll click OK. So now we have a source that this build can use. I'm going to rename this. So it's just primary build. You can name this whatever you want, frankly. All right, so I should have explained this to you ahead of time, but you're going to have to install something from the Visual Studio Marketplace. So let's go over here to visualstudio.com, Marketplace, search for Dynamics, select the Dynamics 365 build tools, select install. So there's an issue with VSTS trying to use a a different Azure Active Directory identity. I'm logged in this browser session to multiple Azure Active Directory instances. So this is a little bit of a confusing part of the step. I apologize, but I'm going to launch a new incognito window and do the same thing. So we'll go visualstudio.com, marketplace. Oh, Visual Studio Team Services, Dynamics. Go ahead and install that. In this case, it's going to ask me to sign in. I'll do that. If you're already signed in with the right account, then what you'll see next is your Visual Studio account that you want to deploy this extension to. I'll click confirm. All right, proceed to account. Okay, so we should be good now. What you'll notice over here in extensions is that I have that extension installed. I'll go ahead and close my incognito window. I'll close this window. And I think I may have to re-import this. Let's try that one more time. I'll go over to builds. So if you're following along, I apologize. You're going to want to install the extension first and then import the build. Same thing, we'll come over here, hosted VS 2017, sources I've already configured, but if you haven't, make sure you follow the steps to configure it. This time you'll notice that it recognizes, in this case, I'm using an unmanaged solution for this environment to keep it simple. You'll notice in the GitHub repository, one of the things that we have as a work item is to show some examples of going from dev environment with unmanaged solution to test and prod with managed solutions. But for now, this should get you started with some basic scenarios. All the other tasks here should just work. So I should be able to now save and queue this build. And let's go ahead and rename this again. Save and queue. Notice it's going to go on the hosted agent using the master branch from that remote repository. So we'll queue the build and we can go look at the build while it's queuing up. So this is running on that hosted VSTS agent. Notice that we're number one in terms of the position in the queue. And any moment now, this will probably pick up. All right, so I just refreshed this and you'll notice that we're now running the code on the hosted agent, or running the build on the hosted agent. So it's initializing the agent. Now it's initializing the job that's going to run on the agent. It's copying all the source code from GitHub. It's doing a NuGet restore. And in the interest of time, I've edited some of the NuGet restore out so that you don't have to sit there with that awkward silence. Now it's building the solution. Once that's done, it's using the VSTS task to pack the solution, zip up the sample data, and finally, it's copying all the files and publishing them to the drop location so that a future release can take the assets from this particular build, and if that build is determined to be release worthy, then be released to one or many environments. All right, so if we go back to the primary build, we'll see that we have one build so far, and that's the build number. So let's go over to releases. So to import this, there is no import button when you have an empty project, so it's a little bit wonky. I have to create a new definition here, make it an empty process, and just save this so that I can then get this experience. And there may be a better way to do this, I just don't know it, but now I can import a release definition. So I can go ahead and browse, and in fact, before I even do that, I can delete this one and then import the release definition. Again, I'm pulling this from my local disk and importing it. And very similar to the build, you'll see that we've got some things missing. So first, in the agent phase, again, we have to tell make sure that we select the hosted VS 2017 agent, and then everything else should be okay, except we have to make sure that we set the variables appropriately. And notice in this case, I've got sort of placeholders for a lot of these variables. So for your domain, it's got to be your domain. So I'll pick mine. I'll call this dyn365-ce-devops-part-one. This is friendly name is the name of your, so this is the domain for your CRM instance. This is the name that you want to show up in the CRM Online Admin Center. So I'll call it something like testing VSTS deployment. I want it to be a sandbox. I'm using the online management API endpoint that's admin.services.crm.dynamics.com. If you're in another geo, you would have CRM, 9 for GCC or others for the respective geo. Since passwords aren't stored when you export, I have to come in here and give it a password. Next thing I need to do here is set my secure config. And in this example, we're just demonstrating how to set secure config. So in this case, this value can really be anything. The online management API needs to know what version of Dynamics 365 you want the instance to be provisioned as when you do the reset. And you can get this GUID by using the PowerShell scripts. But I pre-populated the GUID, your tenant, right? So this is your Azure Active Directory tenant, and in my case, it's marksc at marksc.onmicrosoft.com, and then we're composing the Dynamics URL for the actual instance, and then the user is marksc. So then my username is going to be marksc at marksc.onmicrosoft.com. And if you save that, hopefully we don't get any errors. Nope. So now we can create a release. And again, this is a manual release. So when I create it, all it's basically saying is, I missed one thing. Sorry about that. So if we go back to all definitions, go back to edit this, we have to delete this primary build because it's got a GUID from the project that I exported it from. And we have to add the primary build from this project. Add. Save. Okay. So now I can come up here and I can create a release. And this release is based off of, you get to pick which build. And so we have one build and we'll have one release at this point. And I'll cue the release. But at this point, really nothing gets triggered because this is, again, a manual release where I choose to deploy to different environments. Again, you can automate this depending on your team, your culture, and your scenario. But for the basic reference implementation, I wanted these things to be manual. So when I click my environment, this will now queue a deployment to the environment based on the values and the variables that we set. And you can kind of watch what's going on by coming over to logs and watching all this stuff deploy. And in the interest of time in this video, I'm not gonna go through all the steps. You kind of get the idea at this point. Having said that, if in your logs you're seeing errors, it's likely because you put together, you have the wrong values in your variables. So the way you kind of debug this is you go look at the log, you go look at what the error is, you see the information in the log output, then you go back and you go, oh, I got a typo in my variable value and that sort of thing. Or, I mistyped the password. Those sorts of things are what will prevent this deployment from succeeding. All right, so in summary, what we've done is walked you through the primary build and the primary release dynamics only to understand how it all works. Then I showed you how to import primary build.json and primary release dynamics only.json into your own VSTS project and get it all configured with the ultimate goal of accelerating your ability to use Visual Studio Team Services to build and deploy your Dynamics 365 applications.